Remember that Stokey's Dictionary of ASL had already been published in 1960, declaring that there were internal components of signs. This was his analysis in a search for structure, and found that, in fact, there were components of signs. But people found this hard to believe because of their own prior experience with sign. They wondered if this was just a byproduct of his ideas from working on this book and how he organized it. Prior to the book, though, Stokey already thought a great deal about this and had taken linguistics classes. There, he learned that researchers claimed that sounds of language must have internal components. So, he thought he'd apply that same thinking to sign language, which is how he found that there were internal components, leading him to publish the book. This led people to question whether signers actually process signs according to these internal components in their minds. This is the topic for this lecture section, research that has helped answer that question. But that was 1970. I was just starting graduate school, and we didn't have any of the technology that we do today, with machines that can measure brain activity while the mind is processing language, revealing patterns of activation across the brain. Not having anything like that back then, instead, we had to find a way to see if people really were using these components to form signs. That's what I'll discuss today. People who study psychology, myself included, my degree is in psychology, always think about whether behavior is regulated by the mind. That means you'd have to observe people while they're using language, as their behavior would reveal these components. In other words, what people had long thought about structure and rules was all theoretical. You have to look at what people do. Their behavior is used as evidence. That means psychologists would use this evidence to support the psychological reality of sublexical structure. So, if words do work through internal components, you would see it appear in their behavior through errors or reversals of the components. This approach that combines psychology and language is called psycholinguistics. So, if you want to study sign language, the first challenge is this. Especially for non-signers or adult learners who want to study sign language. Although I am a native signer, I didn't know of any deaf community members involved in this research that was already underway. When I entered the field, I realized that they wanted to know how to distinguish gesture and sign language. Now, to me, that question didn't seem too difficult, but it was a worthy challenge, stated here. Making the distinction seemed easy to me, but new or non-signing researchers weren't sure, perhaps because they weren't fluent enough to understand. Their thinking was that apparently signers encode signs as pictorial imagistic representations. This means if they already thought signing was like gesture, then they perceived signs as images. Surely when fluent signers tried to help researchers learn, they'd encourage them to think in pictures, which of course made them think that fluent signers also think in pictures when producing signs. This caused a great deal of confusion, and what this meant was that new or non-signing researchers presented with Stokey's conclusion about components of signs now had an idea that they could study to prove or disprove his work. The solution to this question was to search for behavioral evidence for linguistic encoding. This means whether people are perceiving or expressing language, they're dividing it into parts or encoding it. So your own utterances are made up of segments, that's encoding, or when listening to an utterance, you understand it in segments, that's also encoding. Now I'll start with the output of mental representations. This refers to whether your mind creates images or a series of components. These are mental representations, but what a person actually ends up saying is easier to observe. This is the output. The trouble with this was that researchers couldn't distinguish when fluent signers were using gestures or when they were signing, which are two different things. They wondered whether both have the same basic structure. Non-signers, of course, have their own conceptions about what it means to communicate through gesture. You may be able to convey meaning effectively, but you would have to rely on creating pictures, which are iconic. So, researchers placed iconic expression at one end of a spectrum, which is where gesture falls. While in spoken language, it's hard to see the connection between sounds and any aspect of their real-world reference, their shape, information, or action. The spoken word remains static, even if the real-world referent changes. The word is the same for naming objects like cat. The letters CAT are pronounced the same way, no matter what kind of cat you're talking about. So those basic units were considered arbitrary and placed on this end of the spectrum to represent language. These poles could be compared and contrasted, but where would sign language fall? Some said it falls on the language end. It has meaning and components. Like Stokey, he said it has parts, so it's language and belongs here. But others said it looks like gesture, and that it was indistinguishable in the real world, whether people were gesturing or signing. Moreover, fluent signers encouraged people to think in pictures in order to sign as well. This was a reason to place sign language on this end of the spectrum. Now researchers had to investigate to see exactly what really happens. Your homework has to do with distinguishing language from gesture. You'll watch a series of film clips of a person either gesturing or signing, and you'll have to decide which end of the spectrum to put that film clip on. Some of the forms may look similar or quite different. You may be able to tell easily that some signs are more iconic than others, but your ability to distinguish signs from gesture will largely depend on fluency. Signers may know the difference right away, while non-signers may have to rely on what they know about gesture. You may also want to compare pictures to the video clips to determine which segments are language and which are gesture. That's your homework.